Welcome to Developing Characters Through Play. My name is Molly Maloney. I guess we'll introduce ourselves.
Yep.
I'm a game designer. I work currently at Telltale Games. I've worked at a bunch of other places. It's nice to meet all of you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fred Wan. In my day job, I'm a lawyer. For the last 14 years or so, I was also the assistant story lead and narrative designer for a card game and role-playing game called Legend of the Five Rings.
And James Portnow will allegedly be joining us shortly. So just to kick this off, I just want to introduce this panel as this is the panel that I wanted to go to, but now I can't because I'm here. Basically, games are such an interesting medium, right? Because we are always playing a character, but what does it mean to be that character, and how do we learn about the character that we are? That sounds kind of highfalutin. Hey, James, you came. You came.
So how's the panel going?
Oh, you know,
I'm better without me, I understand.
hit and miss. I'm good. You want to introduce yourself?
No, look, Fred.
Good afternoon, sir.
All right. Are we on introductions?
Yes.
We just did them, so you literally could introduce yourself right now.
Well, I just did dramatically.
And that's a different kind of character.
Yeah, my name is James Portnow. I'm a game designer by trade. I have worked on things from the Call of Duty series to Farmville to stuff for Riot to things for Square Enix. And in my spare time, I write a show on the internet called Extra Credits. And so that's me. Lunch, excellent.
Mince.
Like me, yeah.
So where are we starting this thing?
I was just talking about how it was the panel I wanted to go to. Now I'm giving it, and you're basically caught up now.
Okay, good. I wanted to go to this one too. I definitely showed up.
Oh man, this is gonna be so
This
good.
could be rad. I'm waiting to hear what everyone's today.
So anyway, so what fascinates me about character development is we play games all the time, but what does it mean to learn who you are? Like, you've got amnesia tropes, you've got these different things where you play a game and you get to choose dialogue options, but what makes it fun? Like, what allows you to develop yourself, and what can we do to develop a character through playing the game rather than telling you who you are?
Well, and one thing I just want to add to that is the reason it's so important to develop it through playing the game is in a game we spend 90% of our time playing rather than getting exposition or narrative text in most cases. And so if we're not using that space to develop the character, we're losing so much character development. And so as a game writer, you have to, or even a game designer, you have to make use of all that space, and something that we don't do enough.
And it's something we're not conscious enough of. Like, I'll throw out an example to get us started. In a lot of strategy and card games, you're not supposed to be some omniscient off-site character. You're the commander, or you're a summoner, or you're a planeswalker, or whatnot. But in all of these games, you are different in kind from anything else in the play area, right? I'll use Hearthstone for an example. Minions are cheap. Minions die fast. Magic, same thing, right? It doesn't matter if something is supposed to be an angel that can break planes. 2 mana, Doomblade, it's dead. And that communicates a message. It tells you as a player that you are way more important and they're just pawns, right? And I'm not sure that when we design, we're always thinking about that. But that's part and parcel with the way people look at their games, right? If StarCraft players do not get attached to Space Marines.
I name every one of my Space Marines.
Have you not
They're all-
played XCOM? I'm sorry.
Yeah, right? But XCOM uses different tools,
Yeah.
right? You have progression, which gives you a mechanical attachment, and you have that randomized specialist thing, which is really annoying, but XCOM actually handles it a little better to make you care because you're supposed to.
Have you played XCOM 2 yet?
Not yet.
Because one of the things I loved, which is so ridiculous, and so silly about character attachment. But as you level up, you also unlock more aesthetic choices for your characters. So literally, when your guy gets badass, you put on shades. It's very silly.
They know what they've got going on over there.
Fire Emblem.
Yeah. Right.
So I think we're gonna get into Fire Emblem a lot, and there's a game I want to talk about called Brigandine. Has anybody played Brigandine on the PS1? We have one person. Yes.
I played it a little when you told me to.
Good. Well, now I can actually talk about why I would recommend it. But I think there's actually narrative and strategy games is something we overlook a great deal, and I think there's so much we can do in that venue. But I didn't mean to totally derail. I'm gonna throw the ball back to you.
Well, and I was just kind of getting it started, but narrative and strategy games, I'll give an example of an unfortunate example in the context of a great game, Alpha Centauri. Some of you have played Alpha Centauri. It is a 4X game, Civilization style, sci-fi, and it's probably the only or best example of having narrative in a traditionally narrative-free environment. Having said all that, and I cannot say enough good things about this game, there is one character, one of the playable faction leaders, where none of her dialogue syncs up with her mechanics, and as a result, players have all assumed she's much worse of a character than she is portrayed as, and that's the character Miriam Godwinson. She's the leader of a faction that is supposed to be a religious fundamentalist conservative faction. All of her in-game cutscene quotes and dialogue quotes and so on reflect a very thoughtful, kind of philosophical, reserved, but like, what is the price of technology sort of person, right? Like at one point she says, well, if we turn all of our industry and all of our technology development, all of that gets turned over to robots. Why do they need us? And that's not an invalid question to ask because that's part of the narrative of the game. But mechanically, her faction has a 50% research penalty for the entire game in a 4X game, and the only benefit they get is to get a bonus when attacking. That's the faction. So try to persuade to a player that the leader of the faction is a thoughtful, philosophical person who has any merit to her points, when her faction can attack, and that's it.
Well, and I think that that's a really good point, because when it comes to designing a game, like thinking about your mechanics and thinking about how to use those mechanics to tell a story, there's nothing more important than that. Like, I look at things like, you look at what Life is Strange is, which is a pretty interesting and cool game, and it's about solving a mystery, right? And your entire mechanic is about rewinding time to gain information.
Well, and it puts that choice that they give you, it puts more weight on that choice, because now that you've seen both sides, you know you're doing something wrong every time.
Right, exactly. And it's like they knew what their mechanic was going to be, and they built a story around that, capitalized on that mechanic. An opposite version is Gone Home, where your mechanic in that game is to look at things, read things, analyze, and try and understand what's going on. But my favorite moment in Gone Home, which is a great character building experience for your voiceless protagonist, is when you pick up that naughty note about your sister's sexual encounter, and after a half a second it says nope and closes it. A game about looking at things won't let you look at things, because it's a great moment for you to be that person. And, like, I understood myself and have similar experiences.
Well, and I think that we often, when portraying characters in games, don't necessarily think about the mechanics, even though they do constrain our story writing. Like, even in traditional RPGs, right? You cannot write the same character for the character that's the white mage as you can for the character that's the warrior. Just because of the mechanics that they portray in game, it doesn't make sense for them to have the same personalities.
And mechanics can often help you set the tone as a world. Like, Gears of War, particularly the early games, is supposed to be gritty, ugly, you're fighting because you have to, death is around every corner. It's a cover-based game. Warhammer 40K Space Marine advertised itself on cover is for the weak. both are first-person shooter mechanics. One of the two strongly encourages you to not peek around a corner. The other encourages you to go into melee in order to regain health because you've executed your opponent. Because that's how Space Marines show their devotion to the Emperor. And that's a good example in both games of having mechanical systems that help you go, oh yeah, that's how this universe works.
In Mythos and Call of Cthulhu, right? Simply having the sanity meter as one of your character's stats and having things that drop your sanity very much reinforces the world itself. And so I think all the time it plays so much into our writing because of how present it is for the player.
Yeah, no, it's definitely true. I even think about things like Amnesia that had an insanity meter of sorts, or interesting mechanics from that game, like inching the door open. Like, would that game have been nearly as fun if you didn't have to painfully inch the door open every time? I think not. I don't know if it built the character, but it was an amazing mechanic for that game.
Do we want to do questions at the end? Or
We can do, I don't know, what do you think?
I think we should open up the questions fairly soon,
Okay.
just because I would love to hear it.
Sure.
Up to you. This is your panel.
I think we'll wait until
Okay.
for a little while, if
Okay.
you don't mind, but hold it.
Okay.
To jump back to your thing about the strategy games, and I wanted to tell about the Brigandine, because for all of you, how many of you guys have played one of the Fire Emblems? A fair number of you. Okay, great. Brigandine is basically, in my opinion, one of the best Fire Emblem games to ever exist. It is Fire Emblem in terms of mechanics, except for one thing. Narratively, you can choose from like 6 factions. It's got an overworld map, and it's a civil war. This is a country going through a civil war. And what makes it amazing is that depending on what characters you bring into battle, those characters, they all know each other because this used to be one united country. And so they'll have different dialogues depending on who you bring in with each other, like the main hero characters, because they used to be on the same side. They used to work together, right? And so they'll try and convince each other to change sides or ask them why they're doing this, or say, hey, I can't fight you, right? And so you get this amazing character development for all these characters in a way that you can't even in any other medium, because it's entirely dependent on what choices you make in terms of who you bring into the battle and who you're fighting, because you can make a lot of choices on who to fight in the overworld map. And you get all these touching moments that are really evocative of a civil war in a way that I haven't seen a lot of games be able to cover, because they brought that in mechanically.
Well, it's like they don't even have to do that. Like, you look at how many games that are that style of game that don't touch on those ideas, but what a better game it is for that.
Yeah.
I mean, Fire Emblem is the same way, where it's like you could have a raw strategy game, but I know a lot of people who play it because of the relationships, which is probably why they just launched a version of Fire Emblem that is about relationships. Like, it's really interesting, like, just because finding ways for the player or the character to shine despite the medium is, I think, really important.
Well, even in Fire Emblem, the relationships are entirely dependent on the team-up mechanic, right? And I don't think you could have a strategy game of that nature about relationships or have it be as strong without having the like squad, the team-up mechanic where people fight together and become closer through participating in these life and death situations.
On team-ups, how many of you have played Chrono Trigger?
Oh, yeah.
Magus does not have a native double tech or triple tech. That alone speaks volumes about how he holds himself apart from the entire rest of the playable cast, right? It's actually surprisingly easy to slip in little things here and there to make your characters just a little bit more vivid. I'll go with one.
I have an example of this too, but I can wait.
Okay. I'll go with one more example and then turn it over. In 2D beat-em-ups, when you hit an enemy, they flinch. Bosses don't flinch. You now know, on one more level, in addition to the mechanical benefits and of having a boss fight, that this character is different in kind, right? Bebop and Rocksteady are not foot soldiers.
Yep.
So my example, I'm a big adventure game fan. probably why I work at Telltale. And I enjoy playing them on my off time a lot. And I recently played through a series called the Blackwell Legacy games. I don't know if anyone has tried them. I recommend them. But the gist of it is it's about a woman and her ghost familiar, and they solve crimes. What is not to like about that? But one of my favorite things is you do when you go through these screens and you're doing your typical adventure game thing. You look at a lot of objects. You try and use objects with objects, and you can live switch between your protagonist and her ghost. Her ghost being Joey from the 1920s, a very mysterious figure. And what I loved about it was when you look at things as your modern protagonist, she'll look at, say, her computer, and she'll say, "It's my computer." You switch to Joey, and he looks at it, he says, "Oh, it's a talking box. She uses that thing all the time. I don't get it." Or she'll look at a bottle of wine, and she'll say, "A bottle of wine." And then you'll switch to Joey, and you'll be like, "Oh, it's a rosé from, like, 1933. It's such a weird thing because it's like an adventure game. We all know you have to look at stuff. That's all you do. But I love the fact that it's like they took their two protagonists and it's like, oh, this is a great opportunity to tell a story about what kind of person Joey is. He doesn't talk about wine ever, but now I know that. Like, oh, he liked wine. And that's like the spice, I think. There's so many little ways that you can put that kind of stuff in. And it has to start from the beginning. Like, you have to look at the type of game you're making and think, what are the mechanics and how can I use that to my advantage?
Have you gotten to talk about L5R and the character development in that,
Sure.
and the character development through the mechanics of organized play?
Sure. I'll use, yes, so Legend of the Five Rings was divided into clans, and players gravitated onto clans,
Just
right?
real quick, how many of you guys have played Legends of the Five Rings? Okay, a couple of you.
More than I thought, actually.
Does everyone know it's a collectible card game?
And a role-playing game.
Yeah, well, yes, and a role-playing game.
The role-playing game's probably better known.
It's, but I think the character development in the collectible card
CCG
game is the
more
most
interesting.
fascinating.
Yeah. So what we did as kind of one of our big things was players had a direct say on the storyline, both in terms of winning events and in terms of stuff that happened that was interesting that we would canonize. So I'll throw out two examples because they're quick. At one event that I wasn't at, but that someone from the team was, a player had a nasty accident and fell down some stairs, busted their head open, got shipped off to the hospital. He came back before the end of the event, no chance of making it to the limb rounds, no chance of winning prizes. He came back just to play. A few sets later, there's a version of a character who has the trait text, whenever he dies, at the end of turn, bring him back into play. And that was specifically because we had seen something in the context of play and decided, this is cool, right? Another thing we did, is that John Cena? That's a John Cena song. In another event, we had two players in the finals of a major event to determine who the Emperor's personal champion would be for the next few years. One player was of the Crane, the most artistic, one of the most honorable, a clan that stood for everything that a samurai should aspire to be, and on the other was a Scorpion. The name really does say it all. But the two of them were friends, and they turned to the team and said, we would like to have the Crane contender in the story concede to the Scorpion for mysterious reasons. And I, the player, will concede to the Scorpion player. And we like good stories, so we ran with that. And so there are ways to do non-standard relationships, but it is harder in the context of a purely digital medium because it's harder to have non-quantifiable stuff that doesn't feel arbitrary to the end user.
Well, one of the things that I really liked is that in the L5R examples, you, one, have the storyline pushed by the players and how the players utilize the mechanics, especially in a tournament environment. And there's a bunch of these, right? There was a tournament where players were playing for a lot of money, right? High-end, like world championship type tournament. And two players are sitting there, and the judge comes up to them and goes, hey, it's time to start, guys. And they just sit there. He goes, you know, guys, I have to disqualify you if you don't start playing the game. And one of them just turns to him and goes, I will not fight my Lion Clan brother, because they were both playing Lion decks. Yeah. And that made it in, right? And then there was for all of you who play Magic, there's a character that's functionally the ornithopter of L5R, who was this common, worthless card. And one year a set came out where one of the tournament players figured out that they could potentially make a semi-competitive deck using this character, Toku. And so with a lot of luck, they actually ended up winning a lot of these tournaments, right? Or a lot of the main tournament. And all of a sudden, there's another version of Toku that gets printed who's a little better, because Toku was just a Ronin who was kind of your Seven Samurais pretend Ronin, who wasn't even necessarily really a samurai. But then he gets backstory, and he starts to grow. People like him. And so people start playing Toku decks. And then he starts leading a peasant rebellion, and people make up a clan for him, the Monkey Clan. Eventually, after years of play and years of tournaments where people as players decide to play this character, he becomes the emperor, essentially.
Well, the Emperor's head of the Imperial Guard.
Right. So he becomes one of the most powerful guys in the entire world of this game from being Ornithopter.
Because the players chose to make him so.
Right. Because the designers and narrative designers integrated the mechanics of organized play, right? They observed how players were actually playing this game, what they wanted out of how they were utilizing mechanics, and use that to further the narrative and really develop one of the characters around how the players were actually playing him.
Man, I don't even know what to say to that. That's incredible.
I think the word is awesome.
That is awesome. Yeah, I mean, in what I do too, I mean, it's interesting because I work in episodic games, and listening to the players and listening to what players want is so important. I think one of the nice things about being in active development all the time, that's what we call it, active development.
The rest of us do passive
yeah,
development.
just use
We
lay
just
around.
hang out.
But that's the great thing. Like going on our forums, seeing what people latch onto. I was recently working on an episode of Minecraft Story Mode, and I was fiddling around, and a friend of mine who worked with us sent me a link to our forums where there was nothing but fan art of this small group of engineers that you saw for 10 minutes, but they were making sandwiches and cookies and hanging out and playing cards, and we didn't even seeing how people react to things is really special, and it really motivates us to put more of those little moments in for other people, or bring back characters that you didn't think were going to come back.
Can I ask a question
I have
that's been bugging me?
What?
No, because this is great, and this is one of the things that I kind of wanted to ask both you guys, and since this is the panel that we wanted to see, one of the things that I've always struggled with as a narrative designer and as a designer, because my background is more in traditional mechanic systems and world design, so much of what we do is based on player feedback. And I think it's great, right? We want to test and iterate. You want to refine your game. And yet, at the same time, we clearly can't take all the player feedback. And in fact, I think we've seen some examples of games where they have, in the end, caved to player feedback.
Yes.
And potentially made the experience worse for it. So where do you draw that line? How, as a designer, do you draw that line between I want to incorporate all the things the players are saying, and as the designer, I have a perspective that they don't have. I know what's coming up in ways that they don't, and so while their feedback may be totally valid for what they've seen, it will be better the way that we're going about it because of things that the player just has no access to.
Well, the first thing that came to my mind actually is a little story that doesn't totally answer your question, but it was interesting to me. And that was like a Steve Jobs story where he talked about if you asked a user what they wanted from the next phone, they would ask for like a cooler flip phone, or like better, more receptive buttons, or a better lighting, or they want to improve on the experience that they know. But he's like, but I will give them what I want to make, and they will love it because he's Steve Jobs. But I actually think there's a little bit about that. We listen to feedback. I listen to feedback because it's so important. But at the same time, you have to understand what kind of feedback services what you want to do. When a player makes a choice in one of our games, and they don't like. Wait, but you know that everybody's had this. Like you're playing Mass Effect or whatever, and you go to hit a button that says something, and your Commander Shepard says the wrong thing. Like it's like, oh, I thought that was gonna be nice. That is frustrating. I want that kind of feedback. Like I want people to tell me that. But, you know, certain types of feedback aren't going to help you. Like, I want your game to be longer, or I want, you know, I want fewer of those pesky cutscenes where we develop all the characters.
The Telltale game?
But, you know, like, those are the kind of feedback. Like, you have to, I listen to all feedback. But in your heart, like, you're a creative person, and you have to know what kind of game you want to make. You put yourself in the player's shoes, because I am a player. And it's like, I make the game that I think not only I would like, but everyone will like. And some of it involves listening, and some of it involves believing that what you're doing has merit. And might not be directly servicing the feedback, but like Steve Jobs said, you know, they'll like it when we give it to them.
And I'll take a slightly different tangent on that, in that I routinely reviewed and listened to like everything. But what I was always trying to do was what underlying demand, what underlying desire is actually not being met when this feedback comes in. Like, because I had like kill or not kill authority over characters in the canon, there would be often times where people are like, I really want this person to survive this. And I'm like, I need to write a tragedy.
Well, and that is, I mean, that is a really, because even to take the examples that everybody's probably pretty familiar with, when Final Fantasy VII came out, there was a ton of blowback against, oh, why do you kill Eris? Why can't I revive them? Like, and the same with like Palom and Porum, right? And yet, over time, we have come to acknowledge the fact that those would be much weaker games if you could actually, if they weren't tragedies,
Yes.
right?
Right? And so at some point, you have to make a call of what players, where you believe players playing this game want this kind of emotional experience. And I acknowledge and accept that I actually won't meet your feedback, because your feedback says don't kill this person. But you will be happy with the result, even though, because the underlying thing is you want something you care about to have a result you care about.
And that's what I was going to say. It's actually meaningful, though, for us to know that you don't want to kill the character, because then we know exactly what killing the character will do.
Yeah, I can't even begin to speak to that point.
Game design is really about Schadenfreude. So.
Yeah, no, it's, you know, but you gotta also know it's heartbreaking for us too. Like, there are people who die in games that kill. It makes me so sad. You know, it kills us to do it too. But it's like when your motivation is to make people feel, and I mean, I think that that's the heart of any game. Like, we want you to feel. And there are a lot of ways to make people feel. Like, I worked on Tales from Borderlands, arguably a pretty funny game. And, like, you can make people laugh, you can make people cry, but at the end of the day, like, I want to work on a game that makes you put down the controller and say, I felt something today. I discovered something about myself. Or I had a meaningful reaction to a relationship with another person. And every opportunity, I mean, anything can be an opportunity in a game for that. You just have to thoughtfully look at it and think, where can I put the emotion in this content?
Anecdotal story. Before I worked on L5R, I played it. And before I was part of the story team, my favorite character in the setting had been killed off in a way that I found narratively unsatisfying. But there was an out because of the art that had come out where you could reasonably argue that that character had escaped death. Years later, I'm writing something that's retrospective, something earlier in the timeline, and I'm like, I can save her. Or I can write her final story and have the sacrifice that she makes be worthy. And
Tell me you saved her.
Bushido, Judy, she ends up going to her death knowing that she could have escaped it by choice, because that's what the Empire needed. And it is difficult to ask that of anyone in, like, as a player or as a designer. But there are times where the end goal is you want the whole product to be something memorable and meaningful. And pandering on individual bases doesn't work as well. Like,
I'm sorry to interject, but like that hits so close to home because yeah, at the end of the day, like you serve the game. Like I don't serve myself. I want to save this character because I love her voice actor and I love her character and I want her to be in more of our games, but I don't serve myself. I serve the experience. And I have been on the side of arguments that I hated. I have argued for things that I'm just like, somebody stole me, somebody stop this. But you know, it's like, if it's right for the story, it's what you gotta do. And that's the heartbreaking thing about a creative endeavor, I think. And it doesn't always have to be tears, you know, it can be like, you can be fighting for what is more awesome. I remember fighting for how cool like mech fight moves would be in Borderlands 5 or whatever, but like, you know, stuff, it can be fun. But yeah, always, it's not about, like, the best designers I've worked with are the people who can leave it at the door what they love. It's not about putting yourself in the player's shoes. It's about imagining what a player wants. Not what they say they want, but what they actually want. And those things are not the same. And what I want is not necessarily what is right for this game. And being able to divorce that part of you, I think is really important.
Yeah, and actually, I was about to say, I'm not sure how much time we have left, but
Half an hour?
I think half an hour. Like, there seemed like there were a lot of questions. Maybe we should start opening it up.
Let's do it. And so yeah, we don't have a mic, but if you have questions to ask,
We'll try and repeat them so everybody can hear them.
yeah, maybe we could do a line anyway, even though there's no mic. Or
Sure. Yeah. Can we actually keep people to line up over here to ask some questions?
we will try to get through as many of you as we can.
The advantage of sitting in the front row.
Yes. And being mini James.
It's true. All right. Shall we?
yeah, just introduce yourself and then ask your question.
And I'm Ryan, also known as Mini James. And anybody who was here at the extra credits official, unofficial lengthening of the extra credits panel, then you may know me. Anyway, so my question is, do you think we can put characterization into negative possibility space, like feed negative possibility space with characterization?
So the question was, can we put characterization into negative possibility space? And negative possibility space being those spaces in a game where, let's say, you find some big building in Assassin's Creed or some high mountain or whatever that you want to climb, and you get all the way up to the top, and it's been taking you a long time, it was really tough to do. That's just nothing, right? It's just a dead end, right? That's disappointment for the player. Can we use that to create character development? Yes, although that ceases to be negative possibility space, because if your character gets to that point and is actually like, what am I doing with my life, right? That in and of
You
itself is
jump,
some
but there's no
reward.
hay bale at the bottom.
Right.
Oh no!
True ending to Assassin's Creed. But yes, but to me, that is in and of itself a satisfying moment, right? It's a reward for the player getting there, is this moment of character development. And so, but it is a fascinating idea. So I would say yes.
Justin, my question was, do you think it's easier to develop a character with no dialogue or with dialogue, with the character themselves being a silent
Protagonist?
character? Yeah. Yeah.
That's hard.
I think this depends on what you mean by character development, because
The player character, I assume?
Just in the whole context of telling or developing a character through a story, is it easier to develop a character through the story if they're not saying anything, or is it easier if they are saying anything?
That's tough.
I'll use a comic book example. There is a very famous issue of G.I. Joe called Silent Interlude. It was one of the first, like, mainstream comics to have an issue with no dialogue. And I would argue that for that story that they wanted to tell, which is a Snake Eye story and a Scarlet story, it was appropriate. But it really hinges on what message you're trying to get across, right? Like, if you want to tell a story where the character doesn't get a chance because no one's listening or no one's around or they're alienated, dialogue-less is actually really, really good because that helps show metaphorically they don't have a chance to voice their feelings.
You
right?
ask Valve that question, I'm pretty sure they'd say a dialogue-less character is pretty much a-okay for character development.
Yeah, right?
But it depends, you know, it totally depends on, as Fred said, like, it depends on the story you're trying to tell. Like, you probably couldn't do a Life is Strange
Right.
with a dialogue-less character.
Cloud in Final Fantasy VII itself is largely a blank slate. Right? Like, not entirely, but you don't get that much of an, like, you get bits. Would it have been better with dialogue though?
I mean, I was going to say that as designers, there are a number of characters that we actually do call empty vessels or blank slates that it really depends on what you're doing with your narrative, because if the character development, if I want the character development to occur from you as a player, where your imagination fills in the character and develops the character, then leaving it dialogue-free is actually a very, very useful choice. I mean, it sounds really weird. We all think about, like, Fallout or whatever. There's lots of... But for those of you guys who played XCOM, since we were talking about it earlier, many of us sort of invent stories and know that awesome sniper, like the story of that awesome sniper who, at least we remember that battle he was in, who saved everybody, like taking 5 guys down in a group of critical shots. And that's because that character is entirely up to us as a player to build. And as a designer, it's always really important to remember that we are creating something in conjunction with the player, right? One of the weird things about this art and storytelling in this art is that we only tell half the story, right? You as the player, through what you do, tell the rest. And in those cases where we're leaning on that heavily for character development, blank slate works well. Apparently
Wow.
they didn't list
Surprise.
me. They didn't list me on any of the panels. I guess they just assume I will
Really?
show up or not. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
What I would say, Christian, is remember, so I love Dark Souls.
Yes.
I think it's an incredible example in so many dimensions of game design and placement, map design, boss fights, and coming from tabletop side of things, I run gaming over time. I think it's a very model for that. But the one aspect of it I'm kind of on the fence about is character development. All the NPCs in it, they're almost completely optional. Their arcs are hidden from the player unless you really want to seek that out. How is that it seems to me like it's kind of risky decision to make as a game designer, and how do you justify that? I think Dark Souls pulled it off really well, but is that a risk that's worth taking? Did they just manage to luck out really too well?
I have a lot of answers, so I will actually let you guys go first.
Oh gosh. See, you're talking to a person. I actually have real trouble playing games that don't have strong story in them, and Dark Souls is, I think, engineered to be my kryptonite.
I would argue that Dark Souls is an incredibly strong narrative.
Maybe I will walk away from this panel and have to play some Dark Souls.
Yes!
But yeah, because
work here is
I
done.
honestly would say, if I hadn't heard your question, I didn't know there was story.
So here,
I am a monster.
But but sometimes the fact that whether or not you choose to interact with other people being optional is a mechanical choice that influences your narrative, right? There are some games where you have to deal with other people. There are other games where you don't have to. There are other games where the only interactions you have with people are violent, and that mechanical choice tells part of the story. So the fact that not the story per se, but the choice to deal with other beings in this setting is a choice itself tells you something.
I guess it's just that, isn't it the rest of the game is mechanically so strong that being able to avoid that or not interact with the characters in a way, it's still a great game?
So here's what I would argue. Dark Souls does something that almost no other games do, which is create a mythos rather than a traditional narrative. mythos being our sort of mythological cycle, right? And I once heard this famously described as a chain of reading, right? That a mythology, whether it's Cthulhu or Homer, right, is about this idea that your audience will not just have a standard narrative, but will have a group of pieces of this world that you expect them to read and be exposed to over time so they become familiar with the world as a whole, rather than any of these specific narratives within it being important, other than they define the world, right? And that is the remarkable feat of Dark Souls, and it establishes this chain of reading through the item descriptions, through those moments where you interact with a character and get a glimpse of just this one vague part that's a puzzle piece for how you put together this whole mythos that you as a player are coming to grips with, right? And as far as the player narrative, I think it is more important as the player for them to establish a feeling of the world with your player, and critically for your player to be as much of an outsider as you, the player, are to that world. Because in Dark Souls and Dark Souls 2 and all these things, you're sort of thrown into this, but you're not from there initially, right? Even in Bloodborne, that's true. And that allows you to see this mythos not from someone who is intimately connected with its politics or its lore, but rather as the player does, as an explorer of this mythos. And then they give you all these amazing moments where you get to choose, through violence or lack of violence, how you interact with a lot of the characters in this world. And through doing so, come to ask yourself the question, within the context of this world and this mythos, am I the good guy, right? And it leaves you with that same soul-crushing feeling that they want you to have to properly experience their mythology. And so that's why I would say that Dark Souls gets away with it, on top of having strong enough mechanics to get players to buy in enough that they play for long enough to start uncovering that mythos.
I almost want to play it now.
So if you do, there's plenty of people on the internet who have talked in depth about the mythology, and I think as a narrative designer, it's actually fascinating how they managed to establish that. You might get a kick out of watching some of the people who have taken apart all the little tiny details in the scenes and been like, and that's actually how we know that this guy 100 years ago did this thing. Right.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's okay.
So this goes to narrative arcing across multiple either episodes or across the game series, something like that. Are you familiar with Warhammer Fantasy's first attempt at ending the world?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't have to do the narrative. How do you keep that from happening? Having it be a complete just failure to the player, and your narrative ends up awful because player decisions weren't necessarily mapping to what you thought was going to happen. How do you
I have some
account for
experience
that
with this.
and deal with it?
When you are setting out and telling your players how they're going to influence the game, don't make that promise a representation if you are not prepared for the plethora of possible outcomes. Like, we routinely had subject to story team approval as a last basket catch-all for any problems that slipped through in the phrasing and design. And I believe it's been a few years that kind of end times thing in fantasy didn't have those caveats. So in order to have the outcomes they wanted, you had characters acting in bizarrely out of character ways. But it can be done. It's just you have to be careful when you have to control what you offer. It's expectation management, right? If you say any of these three characters is going to do X, then you'd better be darned ready to have all three characters be the ones who do that. And if you want to have the possibility for a discretionary fourth or fifth outcome, you need to design that in.
And I mean, I hate to say it, but there's a couple of, at least on the video game side, if we absolutely have to, we cheat, right? Like, I mean, I hate to say it, but if it's metrics-based stuff, who gets to see the metrics? We do, not the players. And so the truth is, if everyone's going to hate you because the players have trolled the universe, there are other breaks. But if you want to really do an end times thing, if you want to know how to end your world and reboot it, this may sound silly, but comic books have a ton of experience and are really good at doing this.
And sometimes they do it really badly too.
Right, but we can learn from all of
Yes,
that.
right. And the other thing is when you're doing a reboot, you also have to be mindful of what you keep. And players have desires and baggage attached to existing characters. So if you have a new Batman and it's Azrael, some people are going to be like, yeah, it's totally okay because it's a different person. And other people are like, he shouldn't be wearing the cowl.
Well, and I mean, it comes back to what we were talking about earlier, where it's like you take yourself outside of what you think is right. You leave, you check your baggage at the door, right? And I'm not gonna speculate either way on what happened with that particular thing, but it's like being mindful of what people are going to respond well to, planning out what you're gonna do, and sticking to your guns, like really executing. I mean, that's what you've got to do, and sometimes that can, like, the best intentions, who knows what actually happened, you know?
And in an emergency, being willing to be like, we got it wrong, and being willing to own up to that.
Well, and there's also there's very often very creative solutions. If you're
Yes.
really willing to play with your narrative, you're really willing to accept whatever the players do. I mean, I always talk about the Lord British example, where in Ultima Online, when it first came online, like the very first day, Lord British came out to give everybody a speech. Lord British is the principal character, the thing which the whole Ultima series, which was a huge RPG series at the time, revolved around. He was the main character for all of them, sort of, and he was he came out sort of give a speech, and Richard Garriott himself was playing him, right? The guy who designed it, who goes by the name Lord British or General British when he's in space, came out to give the speech. And this is the early days of MMOs, right? And the world crashes because everybody's there to go and see his speech. And so the world crashes, world goes down. And they reboot it in 5 minutes, no problem. Everybody comes back, they've got the issue solved, and he comes back out on the platform, and he's about to give his speech, and everybody starts chucking fireballs at him, right? But because the world crashed, nobody remembered to reset the invulnerability flag. So he was playing a level 1 avatar. So he goes down instantly, right? And Lord British is just dead, right? And there could have been this amazing moment where they embraced it. And because Lord Blackthorn, one of the other sort of rival characters, was right there, and there were a bunch of other characters sort of flanking him, they could have had this moment where one of them says, players, go gather all these like herbs and other things, and so we can do this ritual to revive Lord British. And Lord Blackthorn steps forward and says, stop them. Lord British has been ruling this world for too long. Like, help me take over this world. And created this amazing player moment, right? But instead, they just reset the server again and just pretend as if nothing happened, right? Because they were unwilling to embrace those outcomes. If you can really think around those outcomes, if you can find ways that will be positive for the players, for even the most bizarre outcomes, because we have a lot of space, especially in writing something like Warhammer, to do so. Just being flexible with your world is a big part of it. But one other thing about ending worlds, I find it fascinating, especially in comic books, how often we don't learn the lesson of why we had to end the world and reboot it, right? And so that's another thing I would say to look at. If you're ever in that situation where you're creating a game and it's gone for long enough, and it's usually accretion, that's the problem, but you've been forced to end entirely, reboot the thing, somebody should stop and ask, why? Why did this collapse under its own weight? What can we do next time to not do so? And we haven't done that for like 20 years in comics.
Hello, Colin. I have a question about episodic games as a mechanic and how it affects character development. Because when you develop an episodic game, like you said, you get a chance to get feedback and change some things. And you also have these built-in breaks in the narrative. So how can we use both the feedback and the breaks in the narrative to strengthen the development of the character that you may already have an arc plan for?
It's an interesting question. Arcs are let me think about this. You have an arc plan for a character, definitely. But I think when it comes back to kind of understanding what kind of games you make, right? Because say you make episodic games, you know that you're going to be putting those out one after another, not all coming out together. So you can build in wiggle room for certain things. And I'm not saying that that necessarily exists. There are different cases for all kinds of stuff. It's not, I won't say like the pipeline is established one way or another. But the point being is, just because this character has this arc planned, if there's a lot of feedback from fans, that arc can change. And so we create things where basically when episodes are made, the plan is in place for what is going to happen with a character, but we are always listening to what happens. And I know that's kind of like a political answer, but the answer is like there's no set way that we do that. When people feel a certain way about things, that can influence how things go down. Not usually dramatically. We like telling stories, and so, gosh, I just keep thinking about it as I'm answering it. I'm sorry. We like telling stories, and the story always comes first. But if fans have interesting ideas, I'm not going to say that those don't get listened to too, because you guys are really interesting. So, episodic games are a hairy thing to talk about, and it can be really complicated. Is the real answer to your question. I'm sorry about that.
And your stuff has been sort of episodic.
Yeah, generally there'd be a certain amount of lead time between short stories. Like we bring out one every week, but oftentimes we wouldn't get back to a particular character for 2 or 3 weeks, which fans actually hated. They
Fans
would,
do hate that. You have to be consistent.
right? Well, and part of it was there was an arc where I wanted to space out the fictions to show that the character involved was frustrated at how long it was taking because he was avenging the murder of a loved one. And you have to be aware that sometimes the use of the tool, even if it's narratively appropriate, isn't necessarily what your players as a whole want, right? And that's a back and forth.
Although I think that's sort of also our literacy within games again, right?
Yeah.
Like a lot of artistic devices which are genius are only genius if your audience has been given the tools to understand them. And as players of games, we very rarely talk about this stuff enough. And even in game narrative, we very rarely talk about the techniques of game narrative enough to have a coherent conversation. And sometimes for players to get the really interesting things we do, thereby making doing interesting things the wrong choice some of the time.
Yeah, I remember once in Borderlands where, for Tales from the Borderlands, we ended up taking a little time in between 2 of the episodes, and we actually wrote in a joke at the top about it taking too long. You know, it's like, we do like to nod at stuff like that, and I will say, like, in your finale for each episode, you want people to come back, and that, like, we plan our episodes that way. You know, like, you want to have an exciting end, and you want to have a plan for picking that back up at the top of the next episode. But in terms of character arcs, we like to plan them because we want to make sure that you get a really thoughtful experience. So that's usually how it goes down. Yeah.
Okay, my name is Sam. So, as you kind of mentioned earlier, we talked about Final Fantasy IV. One of my favorite stories. It's like, you know, even though it's linear, it's kind of the same way each time. The way it's written, the way characters come in and out, super awesome. And then taking in contrast to something like Fire Emblem, and specifically that it has an aspect in the game which is permadeath. And in more so recent ones, it's this thing where it's in there and you have on or off, but it's like if you have it on, if a character dies, like it's heartbreaking because you care for them, it's really good, but nobody really says or notices anything about it. Like it doesn't have like any impact on the story, which just feels kind of
So disappointing.
Yeah.
it feels so not like what's the point of having this thing here in the first place? So it leads me to this idea where it's like having something in that game where it's like something that is, you know, by chance, by choice, you know, whatever kind of like variables like make it happen. Like, is it even possible to make that work in a way that feels super believable? Or is it always just gonna be the same where you have to end up writing like 20 games for the one game in order for it to work?
Character death narratively in games that have easy resurrection in game is always much less impactful than it should be because I'm not the only person who's like, why doesn't Phoenix Down work on errors? Right?
It's also very hard to do.
Right.
Like, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go.
My point being is like when a character can die at any time, you think about authored content, right? And you have to write these vignettes that happen. If your character can die at any time, like trying to
Yeah.
figure out a way to fold it into one of possibly 50 conversations, all of a sudden that explodes outward. It doesn't make me any less disappointed when it doesn't happen, but it can be hard to implement.
Well, it's interesting in the Fire Emblem series specifically because I actually think within the context of war, you get away with it more. I've always wanted, I mean, it's grim, but I've always wanted, if you lose a character during a battle and you've got permadeath mode on, I wish they just had some, like, semi-canned, even if they just had, like, 20 different responses. Funeral, right? Funeral scene. Even if it was just, like, a night scene with beers burning and a little bit of text, like a small eulogy, right? Oh, well. But I think the thing is, the reason I think you can get away with, if they're willing to give that much of a nod, because contextualization matters so much, in a war situation, we put death aside a lot more. Like, we have the funeral, but then we have to get on with this because otherwise everyone else dies, right? And so I think you could acknowledge it without having to fall into the writing trap of now we have to make 100 other branching paths, which is impossible for us. Yeah.
But not having characters respond by itself is going to say something, right? Like, and I go back to strategy games. No one cares when an individual unit dies because if they did, someone would care. There'd be a morale effect, if nothing else, right? And that is more work in exchange for a better experience or a deeper experience. And on a design level, you have to decide if that extra level of work is worth not doing what else you could have done in that same span of time.
Well,
It's an investment.
Yeah.
but I think it is key that we find, as designers, it's always the key that we find the cheapest investment. You're always looking for the most bang for your buck, right? And so I think that you're absolutely right that it's an extra investment. But very often I see designers who look at these things as only, if I were to do it at all, I would have to write 100 more pages of dialogue. We can't do it, rather than trying to drill down to what we could do that would give the players somewhat of a satisfying experience.
Is there a version we can live with?
Right. Just so we know, I think we're technically out of time. I'm happy to stay. I'm happy to continue to answer questions. But we're pretty close, so if you have to go to another panel or something, just letting everybody know that you're welcome to flee now.
And I
Well,
don't
thank you,
think
guys.
there's anything scheduled right after.
Oh, good. Great.
I will
Then we'll
check
hang out.
while we keep answering. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you guys all for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we
Yeah,
have
shoot.
half an hour.
We've got half an hour, so anyone who wants to hang out, we're hanging out for half an hour.
So actually, I wanted to ask if you could offer a comment on a game which was Analog Hate Story.
Oh.
And I was just wondering sort of what you felt the overall effect of that particular player interface achieved.
So, I think analog and digital are both an interesting experience. Have you guys gotten to play?
I haven't played
Not
it.
yet.
So I think that idea of the interface was to put you in the role of the character that you were supposed to be taking part as, right? Like, you were doing the things, you were mechanically doing the things that were supposed to be their actions, essentially. And so I think that did help ground the player and put them in the world by putting them in the character they were supposed to be in. It also made it cheaper to produce in some ways. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's mainly its effect was to sync you up with the main character.
Well, the thing about it, I found particular is that there are moments where essentially you're given a chance to lie to another character,
Oh yeah,
but you do not actually know which which is the actual lie.
yeah.
Really?
I'm trying to remember because it's been a long time. I played Analog when it like first came out.
It's when the AI asks you if you've been to Pyongyang.
Oh, sure.
And you don't know?
It's an I hadn't thought about that. I forget. do are both answers true if you choose them? I haven't played through it twice.
Well, I'm not really sure if there's a effect ending on both answers.
Because normally in games what we would do with like that is that's actually you as a player filling in the backstory you want for the character, and so the game will accept either answer and will run with either answer effectively because it affects only a very minor part of the story. And so I'd be curious, I have to go back and look and see if there's an actual difference, if one of them's actually a lie, or if your character is existing in a Schrodinger state where they have both been and not been to Peng Yang, depending on whether or not, until your player answers that question.
I have a segue on this topic.
Yes.
Has anybody here played Firewatch yet?
Don't tell me anything about it. I bought it right before
I
left
will
and haven't
use
gotten to.
generalizations. The intro to that game is incredible. It is one of my favorite intros of a game in recent memory, and it is only text, and you choose things, and is really good. So, not going to go into specifics, but if that question intrigued you, go play the first 10 minutes of Firewatch, because I have not had such an emotional, moving, text-based experience since probably the early 90s.
I think we should drag some people who just entered up onto the panel. This is about writing. No. Are you sure? Are you sure? We all love you. My work here is done. Fuck yeah. You only have to sit up here for 15 minutes. Plus, this doesn't allow you to actually sneak off like all the other ones. How are you doing? Come here. So the thing I love about MAGFest is this is such a community show, and like this is one place where we all get to hang out too. Like at all the other conventions, we're all so busy doing the stuff we have to do for our companies that we never get to do this. And so this is awesome. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Davey. I was the writer of The Stanley Parable and The Beginner's Guide.
All right, so your question.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm also a game developer, small one.
Awesome.
So when we create characters, sometimes a little bit of ourselves and a little bit of our past experiences are snuck into the character and make them a bit more three-dimensional. How do you research a character in which they have life experiences that you never went through, such as dealing with diversity, or on the other side, never dealing with diversity, and having traumatic experiences versus not having? And how do you research that and make that real?
Well, I mean, I can only speak for myself, but I think everybody, this is delicate, right? Because I don't want to say, like, my experience is never experiencing diversity. But my point is like, regardless of what the issue is, if you haven't had a personal experience with it, I find it's not impossible to try and put yourself in the shoes. It's only going to get you so far. But, I mean, I might not know what it is like to have been attacked by somebody. I've never been attacked by somebody. But I know what it feels like to be threatened with an attack. I know what it feels like to be scared. I know how I react. I know I can imagine how I would react if somebody came at me trying to attack me. And you just kind of move with those feelings. I find that usually if you look within yourself, you can kind of anticipate how you'll react to a lot of things. And all you need is that kernel to kind of move with. And then I bounce things off of other people. Like, you don't work in a vacuum. Like, if you don't know that experience, like, I turn to the guy next to me and say, what would you do, you know?
Well, and I think it's important also that for me, we reach outside of our workplace, because very often, like, there has been diversity stuff that I've had to do where it is beyond my ken, right? And so I've gone to community centers. There's been religious stuff I've done where I've sat down with priests and talked to them about their experience. I've done stuff about ableism, where I've had to sit down with people who have had that experience. And on the other side, when I can, and this is me being really weird, I don't actually recommend it, but I actually practice method design, where when there was a thing I had to do, there have been plenty of things about I had to do. The first time I ever shot a gun was for a World War II game, right? There was a game that involved somebody being homeless, and I actually stayed in a homeless shelter for a bunch of days and slept on the street 1 or 2 days to figure out, well, to know, like, could I even, because the character wasn't always homeless, and I was like, could I even hack this, right? Like, could I even deal with this? What would you do making that transition? And it taught me an enormous amount, right? Like, I was just blown away, and the answer is no. I don't know if I could, right? And I really wanted the character to also be able to project that. So I would say, maybe live it. That's probably a bad plan. But definitely talk to people who've really had the experience and sit down with them and spend time with them, because your expertise is experience and transmitting experience, but they've had the experience.
I would add that as a transferable skill across writing, empathy. If you really can feel an inkling of what someone feels, then you can construct that first framework of what someone who's fully in it might be like. And then you should probably check with someone who's more knowledgeable, because otherwise you might be extremely offensive.
And
And I don't mean that like lightly, particularly in sensitive issues,
Yes.
right?
well, and sometimes that option doesn't exist. Like, you're writing for The Walking Dead. I do not personally know what it is like to be attacked by a shambling dead creature. But I know what I think I do, you know, and yeah, just running with it.
Or for that, like Walking Dead. Imagine being afraid all the time. And it's justified. And it'll never get better.
You might not know what The Walking Dead feels like, but you
Yeah.
probably have had hopeless
Right.
thoughts, you know, like you
Right.
can channel those things. So like there's always something within, I think.
I actually posed this question to some writer friends of mine recently, and the most salient answer that I got back was as far as like how much, basically, because there's no clear answer as to like how much research is enough research, or what is the right kind of research, or you know, like you can do your best, but no one's ever going to be like, you did it, or like that's, you know. So the most salient, like very broad answer that I got was, have you done enough research that what you're creating is different than what you would have made if you had not done that research, and at least at that point you've made some progress.
That's amazing advice. That's really cool.
Hello, my name's Adam. In Fire Emblem Awakening, there is a character, I forget his name, someone's gonna remind me in the audience in a moment, but there's a character trait that was played out throughout the entire story where no one can see him, like no one paid attention to him yet. And it was a great little character trait. I really enjoyed the character, and that was not reflected in the gameplay at
Right.
all, because it would be game breaking. So where is a good balance between an interesting character trait and the mechanics that would emphasize it that might break the game? Where is that balance of mechanics and interesting character traits?
Tim, if you need to kick us out, just tell us whenever.
Oh, you're good.
Okay, awesome.
You wrapped up like 10 minutes.
Sure, sounds perfect. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. So yeah.
I mean, I'm a jerk. I would say that character should probably not exist in that game, but that's my gut reaction, you know, like I wouldn't create a game that relied on you being able to see somebody and then have their plot point be they are invisible. I would try not to do that, but that's not really an answer.
Well, so I actually think that you can always balance things. And what surprised me about that character is that they were basically on par with most of the other characters, right? And there were places in the story where they vaguely noticed the character or their effects, right? So I'd have one of those things where the character is essentially invis and enemies won't attack them unless they're within one square, right? Or that character has attacked the enemy within a turn, right? And then I would make that character substantially weaker. So it's really good for assassinating guys who you've gotten down to like 5 health, but he's not really good for standard combat. And then you balance this otherwise massive advantage. So there are always ways systemically to balance these things. You just have to put in the effort to do it.
Right. And that takes time and investment, like everything else in the process.
All right. Would the suggestion be like to avoid writing characters with extreme traits, keep them more realistic, even if it's a game that involves extreme
Yeah, sadly, the question is it depends, and it's a judgment call based on reviewing the facts and your estimates of what changing each thing would be, and then being like,
But no matter what you're doing, just being thoughtful.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
don't write yourself into a corner. Like, always have an answer for that sort of thing. But, yeah.
I think the weird thing about design is that you can design an answer for pretty much anything, right?
Right.
So the point is not which of these has an answer, it's which of these is the answer that feels true to what I want to say, right? And the more clear you get about that on your end, the more that those answers tend to present themselves as you're just exploring what does this system mean, you know? Like, oh, this expression of the system says what I feel and what I want to actually communicate, and this other one is maybe not quite what resonates with me emotionally.
All right. Cool. Thank you for your answers.
So earlier you guys mentioned, you gave an example of amnesia with the insanity meter as a way to give the main character character. How do you feel that it works with like more silent protagonists trying to impose what the character is feeling or something, which directly juxtaposes how the player is feeling? For example, in amnesia, you know, whatever monsters are around, sanity obviously goes down, but the player should be frightened. Like, you shouldn't have to tell the player you are scared now.
This is why I hate the breathing mechanic. You know, like where you're like where there's like a horror thing and you hear your character breathing because it's effective. It makes me feel that thing, but it feels like they're cheating because it's so visceral that I have like this biological imperative to be scared of like like it doesn't like make your chest tighten. I don't know. Like, it's effective.
Fear or an asthma attack?
Well,
Unclear.
It's effective, but I hate that it's not. I hate that there's no like, and the amnesia games do that sometimes.
you can also slant mechanics, particularly when you want to invoke fear. Like, if a player is invested in the game as a mechanical device, you can cheat so much when it comes to fear in particular, because there are so many different ways to make someone go, oh, dear, right? Like,
I'd argue, too, that the protagonist in Amnesia is not a silent protagonist. I mean, the minute you start breathing or you read your own journal entries, like, it's like you start to have ideas about who Daniel is. So it's complicated, right?
The very fact that he has a name.
He's
right?
Daniel, yeah, Dan. But fair. But yeah, no, those kind of annoy me too.
Yeah, I don't know. I just that doesn't feel. It feels like characterization via like you didn't do that. You're just I don't know. It feels cheap.
I think it breaks the wall in a way because I feel like I'm being manipulated, and so there's a part of me that is weeping on the floor with fear, and then there's another part of me that's like, hey.
back when,
Sorry, what it feels like is the game is saying you should be scared either because you're in a scary environment or you should be scared because you have no sanity. And it's trying to invoke fear through a moment that's not actually scary. Just
So like a character entering onto the screen and saying, "Hi, I'm the giddy sidekick." Right? Like,
Yeah.
okay, well I know that. Like, you've communicated that, but I don't feel
I
that.
get
It
that
doesn't.
it's supposed to be scary, but I'm not scared, so why is my character?
Yeah.
back when the techniques it was using were not known generally, Eternal Darkness did so many things right. And if you're not familiar with Eternal Darkness, as your character lost sanity, the game started screwing with you with things like it would turn down the volume of the game audio, but display on screen a little volume bar going down. So you would naturally turn up the volume, right? And then the game would go back to normal volume. Things like that. But, see? Right? Or it would display memory card corrupted. Right? But we have to come up with new tricks and new techniques as expectations, as to what, because things become old hat, right? But at the same time, as players become more familiar with the kinds of things we can do, we can play with them more.
Yeah, I mean, matching what I want to do as a player and allowing me to do that thing in the moment, that's the magic, right?
Yeah.
That's also really hard. I'm going to give another Firewatch example. If you want to cover your ears,
Yeah, don't tell me
it's
anything
very
about this.
general. But there's a point in Firewatch very early. All right, do it.
I'm not listening.
One in Firewatch very early where you encounter these girls and their boombox is really, really loud, and you're standing next to a lake. So I go over to the boombox, I want to turn it off. It won't let me turn it off, it just lets me pick it up. Just chuck it into the lake. It stops immediately, and they start screaming at me for checking the boombox, and I'm like, oh shit, I didn't mean to do it. I'm sorry. Like, it was so visceral, and it was exactly what I wanted to do in the moment, and it felt great. And I'm done now.
Good. It's interesting with fear because, on the one hand, in a game that needs you to feel afraid, we need to encourage that with all the tools at our disposal. What's weird is you look at the Silent Hills, right, and the early 2 and 3 especially, the music serves as the sanity meter and as the breathing, but that music is so disturbed, I find it far more effective, and it is less of a clear telegraph than, and so we can also find other techniques for doing the same thing that may be less of an evident sign.
One short rant. Sanity meters, where your character where you know how far you've got to go before you're out of sanity, inherently kind of, no. If you're losing your grip on reality, you don't know what you've lost.
So this is actually why I always reference Call of Cthulhu and Mythos.
Yeah.
Because unlike these games, I mean, it is your character, and you are doomed from the beginning. And the reason they show you that sanity meter is because you never get any back.
Yeah.
And so what it is a countdown clock that says every single time you are doomed. There is no other way out of this other than madness or death, right?
A great inversion that you like the kind that you were talking about would be to have a sanity meter, but then to have the reactions come at the wrong times. So then, so you'd be like, wait, I should be sane right now. Why are the effects starting in? That's not right.
Or if you're going to mechanic it out, sanity loss is semi-random, like it's on a range, like 3 to 6. And all you know is how many times it's been hit. Or as your meter goes down, the accuracy of the meter goes down, and the player is informed of that.
I think we are closing in on actually having to wrap this thing up. We probably have time for one more question.
Cool.
Hi, I'm Rick, and my question for you all is, there was a great moment in a previous panel about characterization, talking about iconic characters in games in regards to old school iconic characters, Mario, Link, Donkey Kong, and how they didn't have much context and they were limited by the medium and the experience that they could give to the players. I guess, what advice would you have for a game to which you have an iconic character that they're limited by the vehicle of the game itself in terms of how much can I actually explain to the player, the context behind all of this, and there's not as many opportunities in a completely narrative-driven game, and this is more mechanically driven.
Get out of the way of players who want to buy in. And Samus in Metroid, how much do you really know about Samus? Very, very, very little. But there's enough there that if you want to construct a mythos around her, you do, right? And one of the reasons Other M got its reviews is a lot of people had their head canon, and it didn't match the Other M canon. And that's separate and aside from whether it's good or not.
Well, I don't know if that's actually separate from whether or not it's good. I think as a designer, that's actually part of whether or not it's good.
Right.
Mechanically, that game was by Team Ninja, and mechanically it was actually solid, but it was a terrible game. And I would say it's hard to do iconic characters in the same way as we used to, simply because certain characters became icons because every single person had them, and the company promoted them in those senses.
You could say like Nathan Drake,
Well,
I guess is kind of a modern one.
I would actually say Master Chief is the closest, and almost all of the ones I've seen are actually complete empty vessels that are just sort of conduits for the mechanics.
Yeah, I think Master Chief is a great example, actually. I didn't even think about him, because he's defined entirely by another character who rides alongside you. And I think that's a
He's
great
probably more interesting.
modernization of dealing with that.
My suspicion is that the more that your game, the more that the game is, or that the character is being carried by the mechanics, as you're saying, of the game, you probably don't really know how people think about your character, and you're not gonna know until you put it in front of people and see what they're like. I got to imagine that much of the characterization of these long run, decades old franchises that we're talking about, they've probably been steered by fan
Oh,
reactions.
absolutely.
Right? There's probably like you got to believe that the way that people responded to Mario shaped the kind of character that Mario became over time. So I would suspect that one of the best things you could do is just put it in front of people and see what are they actually responding to, and then build on that.
All right, looks like we're out
Thanks a
of time.
lot, everyone.
Thank you, everybody, for staying.